The dust settled around her boots as she pressed her face into her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her chest. And the sound of it stopped Samuel Garrison mid-stride as he rounded the corner of Spokane's general store on that sweltering afternoon in August of 1878. He had been heading toward the livery stable, his spurs jingling softly with each step, when he heard the crying. Samuel paused, his hand instinctively moving to adjust his hat as he considered walking away. A woman's tears were private business, and he had learned over his 26 years that getting involved in other people's sorrows often led to complications. But something about the raw desperation in those sobs made him stop. He stood there for a long moment, the sun beating down on his shoulders through his worn leather vest, listening to her cry as if her heart was splitting clean in two. Samuel had seen plenty of hardship in his years drifting through Washington Territory. He had worked cattle drives from Montana to the Pacific, had survived harsh winters and brutal summers, had watched men die over card games and land disputes. But there was something about the sound of this woman crying alone behind the general store that reached past all his carefully constructed walls. Maybe it was the loneliness in it, the sense that she had come here to hide her pain from the world. Maybe it was just that he recognized the sound of someone who had reached the absolute end of their rope. He walked slowly around the corner, his boots crunching on the dry earth. She was sitting on an overturned crate, her blue calico dress dusty at the hem, her dark hair falling loose from its pins. She had her face buried in her hands, and she was so lost in her grief that she did not hear him approach. Samuel cleared his throat gently, and she jerked her head up, her eyes wide with alarm. Those eyes were the color of honey and sunlight, and they were red-rimmed and swollen from crying. She was beautiful in the way that made his chest tighten unexpectedly, with delicate features and a full mouth that trembled as she stared at him. She looked to be in her early 20s, and there was something about her face that spoke of both strength and terrible vulnerability. "I am sorry," Samuel said quietly, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "I did not mean to intrude. I just heard you crying and wanted to make sure you were all right." She wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassment flooding her cheeks with color. "I am fine," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please, just go." Samuel knew he should do exactly that, but he found himself standing there, studying her face, seeing the desperation beneath her attempt at composure. "You do not look fine," he said gently, "and I have found that when someone is crying alone behind a building, they usually are not." She let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if she could hold back the grief by force of will alone. Samuel looked around, spotted another crate nearby, and dragged it over. He sat down beside her, not too close, but near enough that she would know she was not alone. "My name is Samuel," he said quietly. "Samuel Garrison, and you do not have to tell me anything if you do not want to. But I have found that sometimes it helps to have someone just sit with you in the hard moments." She stared at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for some trick or ulterior motive. Samuel kept his expression open and honest, his hat still in his hands. Finally, she seemed to make some decision. Her shoulders sagged, and more tears spilled down her face. "Margaret," she whispered, "Margaret Ellsworth." "It is good to meet you, Margaret," Samuel said. "Though I wish the circumstances were better." She laughed again, that same broken sound. "I do not think circumstances could be much worse," she said. Then she pressed her hands to her face again, her whole body shaking. "I am sorry. I should not be talking to a stranger like this. It is not proper." "I do not much care about proper," Samuel said. "And sometimes strangers are easier to talk to than people who know you. No expectations, no judgments." Margaret lowered her hands and looked at him again. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but there was something in her gaze that made Samuel's heart beat faster. Trust, maybe. Or just desperate need for someone to understand. "My father died 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice cracking on the words. "He had a heart attack while working in the fields. Just fell over and was gone before anyone could reach him. He was only 48 years old." Samuel felt the weight of her grief settle over him. He had lost his own father when he was 16, and he remembered the hollow ache of it, the sense that the world had shifted on its axis and would never be quite right again. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. "That is not even the worst of it," Margaret continued, the words tumbling out now as if a dam had broken inside her. "My mother died when I was 12. I have two younger sisters, Emily and Caroline. Emily is 19, and Caroline just turned 18 last month. We have been running the farm ourselves since Father died, trying to keep everything together. But yesterday we got a letter from the bank." She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and stared at it with such hatred that Samuel was surprised it did not catch fire. "My father borrowed money last year to buy new equipment. The harvest was bad, and he could not make the payments. The bank is foreclosing. They are giving us 30 days to vacate the property." Samuel felt anger rise in his chest. He had seen this happen too many times, banks swooping in to take land from families who were already struggling. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. Margaret shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. "We have no family left, no money. I have been trying to figure out what to do, but there is no good answer. We cannot afford to buy another property. I thought maybe we could find work in town, but there are not many opportunities for women here. And Caroline, she is so young. She should be thinking about courting and marriage, not about whether we are going to starve." She was sobbing openly now, and Samuel did something he probably should not have. He reached out and took her hand. It was small and rough from work, and it trembled in his. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "I know this seems impossible right now, but you are not alone, and there are always options, even when you cannot see them." "What options?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp with desperation. "Tell me, Samuel Garrison, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to keep my sisters safe when we have nothing?" Samuel did not have an answer for that, not yet. But he kept holding her hand, and he stayed there beside her as the sun moved across the sky. Margaret cried until she had no tears left, and then she just sat there, her hand in his, staring at the dusty ground. "Tell me about your sisters," Samuel said after a long silence. "What are they like?" Margaret looked at him with surprise, as if she had forgotten he was there. Then a small, sad smile touched her lips. "Emily is strong," she said. "Stronger than me, I think. She has been holding us together since Father died. She does not cry, at least not where anyone can see. She just works from dawn until dark, trying to keep the farm running. But I see the fear in her eyes. She knows we cannot do this alone." "And Caroline?" Samuel prompted. "Caroline is sweet," Margaret said, her voice softening. "She is the baby, even though she hates when I call her that. She still has hope, you know. She still thinks everything is going to work out somehow. I do not want to be the one to crush that hope. But I also cannot lie to her. We are running out of time." Samuel sat there, thinking hard. He had some money saved up from years of working various jobs. Not a fortune, but enough to live on for a while. He owned a small piece of land about 10 miles outside of Spokane. 100 acres he had bought 2 years ago, with the intention of eventually building a ranch. He had been living in a small cabin there, working odd jobs in town to make ends meet while he built up his herd. It was not much, but it was something. The smart thing would be to walk away, to wish Margaret well and go about his business. He had his own plans, his own dreams. Getting involved with a woman and her 2 sisters and their problems would complicate everything. But Samuel had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing. "I might have an idea," he said slowly, "but I need you to hear me out before you say no." Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes wary. "What kind of idea?" "I own some land outside of town," Samuel said. "It is not much, just 100 acres with a small cabin and a barn. I have been working to build it into a proper ranch, but it is slow going by myself. I was actually thinking about hiring some help, but I have not had the money for it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What if you and your sisters came to work for me? I could not pay much, at least not at first, but you would have a place to live, food to eat, and honest work. And if we could make the ranch profitable, there would be money for everyone." Margaret stared at him as if he had grown a second head. "You do not even know us," she said. "Why would you offer something like that?" "Because I have been where you are," Samuel said simply. "Maybe not the exact same circumstances, but I know what it is like to feel like the world is crushing you and there is no way out. Someone helped me once when I needed it. Maybe it is time I paid that forward." "That is not a good enough reason to take on 3 strangers," Margaret said, but there was hope creeping into her voice despite her skepticism. "Then how about this?" Samuel said. "I need help with the ranch. Ranching is hard work, and doing it alone is near impossible. You and your sisters need a place to live and a way to support yourselves. It seems to me like we could help each other." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Samuel could see her thinking it through, weighing the risks and benefits. "What would people say?" she asked finally. "3 unmarried women living on a ranch with a single man? It would ruin our reputations." Samuel had thought of that. "We would need to make it clear that this is a business arrangement," he said. "You and your sisters would have the cabin. I would sleep in the barn or build myself a small bunkhouse. We would keep everything proper and respectable. And if anyone had a problem with it, well, they can mind their own business." Despite everything, Margaret laughed. It was a small sound, but it was genuine. "You make it sound so simple." "It is not simple," Samuel admitted. "It will be hard work, and there are no guarantees, but it is a chance. And sometimes a chance is all you need." Margaret looked down at their hands, still joined. Samuel realized he was still holding her hand and started to pull away, but she tightened her grip. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Really?" Samuel thought about that. The honest answer was that he did not entirely know. Maybe it was the way she had looked when he found her crying, so broken and alone. Maybe it was the strength he could see in her even through the tears. Maybe it was just that he was tired of being alone himself, and the idea of having people around, of building something together, appealed to him more than he wanted to admit. "Because I think you are someone worth helping," he said finally. "And because I have a feeling that if you and your sisters put your minds to it, we could build something good out there." Margaret was quiet for another long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I need to talk to my sisters," she said. "But if they agree, then yes. We will take you up on your offer." Samuel felt something loosen in his chest, something he had not realized was tight. "Good," he said. "When can I meet them?" "Come by our farm tomorrow morning," Margaret said. She gave him directions, her voice growing steadier as she talked about practical matters. "I will talk to them tonight, explain everything. If they have concerns, you can address them then." "That sounds fair," Samuel said. He stood up, his knees creaking slightly from sitting so long. The sun was lower in the sky now, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. He had been sitting there with Margaret for nearly 3 hours. Margaret stood as well, smoothing down her dress. Her eyes were still red, but there was something different in her face now. Not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of it. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting with me, for listening, for offering to help. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Samuel said. "Just show up tomorrow, and we will figure the rest out as we go." He started to walk away, but Margaret called after him. "Samuel?" He turned back. "Yes? You said someone helped you once. What happened?" Samuel smiled, a little sadly. "That is a story for another day," he said. "But the short version is that I was 17 and alone and sure I was going to die. An old rancher named Thomas Mitchell found me half frozen in a snowstorm and took me in. He taught me everything I know about cattle and horses and surviving in this territory. When he died 5 years ago, he left me enough money to buy my land. I owe him everything." Margaret's eyes were shining again, but not with tears this time. "He would be proud of you," she said, "for doing this." "I hope so," Samuel said. Then he tipped his hat to her and walked away, his heart beating hard in his chest. The next morning, Samuel rode out to the Ellsworth farm at dawn. It was a good piece of land, he noted as he approached, with rich soil and a decent water source. The fields were planted with wheat, and while the crop was not as full as it could be, it showed signs of careful tending. The house was small but well maintained, and there were chickens pecking in the yard. Margaret met him at the door before he could knock. She looked like she had not slept much, with dark circles under her eyes, but she had brushed her hair and changed into a clean dress. "They want to meet you," she said without preamble. "Come inside." Samuel followed her into the small house. It was neat and clean, with handmade curtains on the windows and a table that had been carefully set with 4 cups of coffee. 2 young women stood when he entered, both eyeing him with varying degrees of suspicion. The taller of the 2 had Margaret's same honey-colored eyes, but darker hair. She stood with her arms crossed, her jaw set in a way that told Samuel she was not going to be easily convinced. "I am Emily," she said. "Margaret told us about your offer. It sounds too good to be true." "Emily," Margaret said, with a note of warning in her voice. No, she is right to be suspicious, Samuel said. He removed his hat and met Emily's gaze steadily. If someone had made this offer to me, I would have questions too. So, ask me whatever you need to ask. The younger sister, who had to be Caroline, stepped forward. She was prettier than both her sisters, with blonde hair and blue eyes and a heart-shaped face. But there was shrewdness in her gaze that belied her innocent appearance. "What do you get out of this arrangement?" she asked. "Margaret says you are offering us room and board in exchange for work, but that seems like you are taking the worse end of the deal." "I get help building my ranch," Samuel said simply. "Right now, I am doing everything myself, and it is slow going. With 4 people working, we could accomplish 3 times as much. I could build up my herd faster, improve the land, maybe even plant some crops. In a year or 2, if we work hard, we could have a profitable operation. That benefits all of us." "And you expect us to believe you will keep your hands to yourself?" Emily demanded. 3 women alone with a man on an isolated ranch? We are not fools, Mr. Garrison. Samuel appreciated her bluntness. "I expect you to trust actions, not words," he said. "I am offering you a way out of an impossible situation, and I am willing to put in writing whatever terms would make you feel safe. You and your sisters would have the cabin to yourselves. I would sleep in the barn or build a separate bunkhouse. If I ever made any of you uncomfortable or acted in a way that was not honorable, you would be free to leave immediately, and I would pay for your passage to wherever you wanted to go." "Put it in writing?" Emily repeated, her eyebrows rising. "We can go to the lawyer in town today and draw up a contract, if that would make you feel better," Samuel said. "I am serious about this being a business arrangement. I am not looking for anything else." That was not entirely true, he realized as he said it. He was attracted to Margaret in a way he had not been attracted to a woman in a long time. But he was not going to act on that attraction, not when she and her sisters were in such a vulnerable position. If anything ever happened between them, it would have to be Margaret's choice, made freely and without any sense of obligation. The 3 sisters exchanged glances, having some silent conversation that Samuel could not follow. Finally, Margaret turned to him. "Can you give us a few minutes to talk privately?" "Of course," Samuel said. He walked outside and stood in the yard, watching the chickens scratch in the dirt and trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. He was changing the entire course of his life based on a few hours with a crying woman behind a general store. It was impulsive and risky and probably foolish, but it also felt right in a way he could not explain. After about 15 minutes, Margaret came to the door and gestured for him to come back inside. All 3 sisters were standing together now, presenting a united front. Emily was still the one who spoke. "We have conditions," she said. "First, we want that contract you mentioned. Everything in writing, clear terms about our work and living arrangements. Second, we keep any wages you pay us. We are not interested in some arrangement where you control all the money. Third, if this does not work out for any reason, you help us find another situation. We are not going to be left worse off than we started." "Those all seem reasonable," Samuel said. "Anything else?" Caroline spoke up. "We bring our chickens and our milk cow. They are all we have left, and we are not leaving them behind." "That is fine," Samuel said. "We could use the eggs and milk anyway." Margaret was the last to speak. "One more thing," she said quietly. "If we do this, we are partners, not employees, partners. We work together to build something good, and we share in the success. I do not want charity, Samuel. I want a fair deal." Samuel felt a smile tug at his lips. "Partners it is," he said. He held out his hand, and after a moment, Margaret took it. Her handshake was firm and sure, and Samuel felt something shift between them, some unspoken understanding that this was the beginning of something important. They spent the rest of the day making arrangements. They rode into town and found a lawyer who drew up a contract that spelled out the terms of their partnership. Samuel put up his land as collateral, agreeing that if he violated any of the terms, the Ellsworth sisters would have a claim to half of it. The lawyer raised his eyebrows at the unusual arrangement, but he took Samuel's money and did the work without comment. Then they went to the bank to see about the foreclosure. The banker, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually sour expression, was not sympathetic to Margaret's situation. "The debt is what it is," he said. "If you cannot pay, we must take the property." "How much is owed?" Samuel asked. The banker consulted his ledger. $340, including interest and fees. Samuel winced. That was a significant chunk of his savings. But he looked at Margaret, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, and made a decision. "I will pay it," he said. "Clear the debt." "Samuel, no," Margaret said immediately. "That is too much. We cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking," Samuel said. "I am offering. And before you argue, think about it practically. If we let the bank take your land, you get nothing. If I pay off the debt, we could sell the property and the equipment. That money could go into building up the ranch, buying more cattle, improving the infrastructure. It is an investment in our partnership." Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but Emily put a hand on her arm. "He is right," she said quietly. "It is the smart play." So Samuel paid the debt, watching $340 of his carefully saved money disappear in a moment. The banker gave them a receipt and a sour look, clearly disappointed to lose the opportunity to acquire the property cheaply. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel helped the Ellsworth sisters prepare to leave their farm. They sold what they could not take with them, the furniture and equipment and surplus goods. The land itself they decided to hold on to for now, with the idea that they might rent it out to a neighboring farmer. It was not ideal, but it gave them a small safety net. During those 2 weeks, Samuel got to know the sisters better. Emily was indeed strong, both physically and mentally. She could work as hard as any man Samuel had ever met, and she had a sharp mind for practical matters. She was also fiercely protective of her younger sisters, watching Samuel with the wariness of a wolf guarding its pack. Caroline was more open, quicker to smile and laugh. She was curious about everything, asking Samuel endless questions about his ranch and his plans for it. She was also surprisingly good with animals, able to calm a skittish horse or coax a stubborn cow with equal ease. But it was Margaret who occupied most of Samuel's thoughts. She was quieter than her sisters, more reserved, but there was a depth to her that drew him in. She noticed things that others missed, the small details that made a difference. She was also kind in a way that went beyond mere politeness. He watched her comfort Caroline when the younger girl cried about leaving the only home she had ever known. He saw her thank Emily for her strength, even as she herself was exhausted. And several times he caught her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Finally, the day came to move. Samuel borrowed a wagon from a friend in town, and they loaded it with the sisters' belongings, the chickens in crates, and the patient milk cow tied behind. It was a long, hot journey to Samuel's ranch, and by the time they arrived in the late afternoon, everyone was dusty and tired. But when Margaret saw the land, she smiled for the first time since Samuel had met her. "It is beautiful," she said. Samuel looked at his property with fresh eyes, trying to see it as she did. The cabin was small and rough, but it was sturdy. The barn was in good shape, and the land stretched out green and rolling under the summer sun. The mountains were visible in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow. A creek ran through the property, providing fresh water year-round. "It needs work," Samuel said. "A lot of work, but the bones are good." They spent the rest of the day unloading the wagon and getting the sisters settled in the cabin. Samuel had cleaned it as best he could before they arrived, but it still needed a woman's touch. The sisters moved through it with the efficiency of people who had run a household before, sweeping and scrubbing and arranging their meager belongings. Samuel made himself scarce, taking his bedroll to the barn and setting up a corner for himself. It was not comfortable, but it would do. He had slept in worse places. That night, Margaret brought him supper, a plate of beans and cornbread that she had cooked on the cabin's small stove. "You should eat with us," she said. "In the cabin. It seems silly for you to be out here by yourself." "I do not want to make you uncomfortable," Samuel said. "You are not," Margaret said. She sat down on a hay bale, watching him eat. "My sisters and I talked. We appreciate what you are doing, keeping your distance. But we also agreed that if this is going to be a partnership, we need to actually work together. That means eating together, planning together, making decisions together. So please, come inside." Samuel found himself following her back to the cabin, where Emily and Caroline were setting the table for 4. It felt strange and right at the same time, sitting down to dinner with these 3 women who had been strangers 2 weeks ago. They talked about plans for the ranch, about what needed to be done first and how they would divide the labor. Emily wanted to focus on the crops, to plant a large vegetable garden, and maybe put in some wheat. Caroline was eager to expand the chicken flock and possibly get some pigs. Margaret suggested that they repair the fences first, to make sure they could safely contain the cattle Samuel already owned. Samuel listened to them debate and plan, and he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope, real, genuine hope that maybe he could build something lasting here, something that mattered. The days fell into a rhythm after that. They rose at dawn and worked until dusk, taking a break in the middle of the day when the sun was hottest. Samuel taught the sisters about cattle and horses, about reading the land and understanding the weather. They taught him about gardening and preserving food and 100 small domestic tasks he had been managing poorly on his own. Emily proved to be as capable as Samuel had suspected, able to mend a fence or dig a post hole without complaint. Caroline had a gift for cooking that elevated their simple meals into something approaching enjoyable. And Margaret was everywhere, doing whatever needed doing, her steady presence holding them all together. The town of Spokane took notice of the arrangement, of course. Samuel and the sisters endured curious looks and whispered comments whenever they came to town for supplies. But they ignored the gossip, keeping their heads high and their business their own. The contract Samuel had drawn up gave them a layer of respectability, and the fact that they clearly worked hard and kept everything proper quieted most of the criticism. About 6 weeks after the sisters moved to the ranch, Samuel and Margaret were working together to repair a section of the barn roof. It was hot work, the late September sun beating down on them mercilessly. Margaret had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and there were sweat stains on her dress. Samuel knew he looked no better, his shirt soaked through and his face red from exertion. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, passing tools back and forth with the ease of people who had learned to work together. Finally, Margaret sat back on her heels and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Samuel said. "Why did you really offer to help us?" Margaret asked. "And do not tell me it was just because you needed help with the ranch. I have been thinking about it, and the numbers do not quite add up. You spent most of your savings paying off our debt and helping us move. You gave up your cabin and your privacy. You are sharing whatever profit the ranch makes 4 ways instead of keeping it all for yourself. So why?" Samuel set down his hammer and looked at her. She was watching him with those honey-colored eyes, and he knew she deserved an honest answer. "Do you remember what you asked me that first day? About the person who helped me?" Margaret nodded. "Thomas Mitchell saved my life," Samuel said. "But more than that, he gave me a reason to keep living. When he found me, I had been wandering for months, looking for work, slowly starving. My father had died, and my mother had remarried a man who did not want me around, so I left, thinking I could make it on my own. I was wrong." He paused, remembering those dark days. "Thomas took me in, and he taught me how to be a man, not just how to work, but how to live with honor and integrity, how to care about something bigger than myself. When he died, I was lost for a while. I had the land and the money, but I did not have a purpose. And then you found me crying behind the general store," Margaret said softly. "And then I found you crying behind the general store," Samuel agreed. "And I realized that maybe my purpose was to do for someone else what Thomas did for me, to help someone who needed it, to build something good with people who deserved a chance." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It is more than that, though, is it not?" Samuel felt his heart speed up. "What do you mean?" "I have seen the way you look at me," Margaret said, her cheeks flushing pink. "And I would be lying if I said I had not thought about you that way, too." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. "Margaret, I do not want you to feel pressured. You and your sisters are here because you needed help, not because I expect anything from you." "I know that," Margaret said. "That is why I feel safe enough to say this. Samuel, you are a good man. You have been nothing but honorable and kind since the day we met, and somewhere along the way, I have come to care for you, not because I feel obligated, but because of who you are." Samuel reached out and took her hand, the same way he had that first day behind the general store. "I have been falling in love with you since I first heard you crying," he admitted. "But I did not want to say anything until you were ready, until you felt secure here and knew that you did not need me. You chose to be with me." "I choose you," Margaret said, her voice clear and sure. "I choose us." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her, gentle and sweet. There on the barn roof, with the sun shining down and the whole world spread out below them. It felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding something he had been searching for without knowing it. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret was smiling. "What do we tell my sisters?" she asked. "The truth," Samuel said, "that we care about each other, and we want to see where this goes. If they have concerns, we will address them. But Margaret, I am not going to hide how I feel about you." They climbed down from the roof and walked back to the cabin together, still holding hands. Emily and Caroline were in the garden, pulling up the last of the summer squash. They looked up when Samuel and Margaret approached, and Emily's eyes narrowed slightly when she saw their joined hands. "We need to talk to you both," Margaret said. They all sat down at the kitchen table, and Samuel let Margaret do most of the talking. She explained how their relationship had developed, how they had both fought against it at first because they did not want to complicate the partnership, but how they could not deny their feelings any longer. Caroline was delighted, clapping her hands together and grinning. "I knew it," she said. "I told Emily weeks ago that you two were perfect for each other." Emily was more reserved. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" she asked. "What if things do not work out? We are all living together, working together. A romance gone bad could destroy everything we have built." "I know the risks," Margaret said. "But Emily, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Samuel is a good man, and I love him. I want to be with him." Emily studied Samuel for a long moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. "If you hurt her," she said finally, "there is nowhere you could hide that I would not find you." "I would expect nothing less," Samuel said seriously. "And for what it is worth, I have no intention of hurting her. I love your sister, Emily. I want to spend the rest of my life making her happy." That seemed to satisfy Emily, or at least convince her to give them a chance. She nodded slowly. "All right then. But we keep everything above board. No sneaking around, no compromising Margaret's reputation. If you are serious about her, you marry her properly." "I intend to," Samuel said, looking at Margaret. "If she will have me." Margaret's eyes widened. "Are you proposing?" "Not officially, not yet," Samuel said. "I want to do it right, with a ring and everything. But yes, Margaret Ellsworth, I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you here on this ranch. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to have children with you and grow old with you and leave something behind that matters. So, when I do ask you properly, I hope you will say yes." Margaret was crying again, but these were happy tears. "You are a fool if you think I would say anything else," she said, laughing through her tears. Samuel kissed her again, not caring that her sisters were watching. This time, when he pulled back, Caroline was crying too, and even Emily was smiling. The next day Samuel rode into town and visited the jeweler. He had very little money left after paying off the Ellsworth debt and buying supplies for the winter, but he had enough for a simple gold band. It was not fancy, but it was solid and real, and he knew Margaret would love it. He proposed a week later, on a Sunday evening, when they had all ridden to a nearby hill to watch the sunset. The mountains were painted gold and purple in the fading light, and the air was cool with the promise of autumn. Samuel got down on one knee in front of Margaret, ignoring Caroline's excited squeal, and held out the ring. "Margaret Ellsworth," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," Margaret said, not hesitating for even a second. "Yes, yes, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him up and kissed him while her sisters cheered. It was one of the happiest moments of Samuel's life, standing there on that hill with the woman he loved and knowing that they had a future together. They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the church in Spokane. Emily and Caroline stood up with Margaret, and Samuel's friend who had loaned them the wagon stood up with him. It was simple and beautiful, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Samuel felt like the luckiest man alive. The wedding night was awkward and sweet, both of them nervous despite their love for each other. Samuel was gentle and patient, and Margaret was brave and trusting, and by the end of it, they were both laughing at their fumbling attempts to figure everything out. But they learned together, and their physical relationship became another way they expressed their love for each other. Emily and Caroline stayed in the cabin, and Samuel and Margaret moved into the small bunkhouse Samuel had built during the weeks leading up to the wedding. It was tiny, just one room with a bed and a small stove, but it was theirs. They made it cozy with quilts Margaret sewed and curtains Caroline helped hang, and Samuel had never been happier in any dwelling in his life. The winter of 1878 was hard, with heavy snows and temperatures that dropped well below freezing. But they had prepared well, with a good supply of food and firewood, and plenty of feed for the animals. Samuel and the three sisters worked together to keep the ranch running. trudging through the snow to care for the cattle and horses, breaking ice on the water troughs, and making sure everyone stayed warm and fed. In the evenings, they would all gather in the cabin, which was bigger and warmer than the bunkhouse. They would play cards or read aloud from books, and Samuel would tell stories about his years drifting around the territory. Margaret would sew, while Emily worked on plans for the spring planting, and Caroline would usually fall asleep by the fire, her head on a cushion. It was during one of these evenings in late January that Margaret told Samuel she was pregnant. They were alone in the bunkhouse, getting ready for bed, and she just blurted it out with no preamble. "I am going to have a baby," she said, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and joy. Samuel felt like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. A baby. He was going to be a father. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure," Margaret said. "I have missed 2 courses now, and I have been sick in the mornings. I did not want to say anything until I was certain, but there is no doubt anymore." Samuel pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "This is wonderful," he said into her hair. "Terrifying, but wonderful." Margaret laughed shakily. "I am so scared," she admitted. "What if I am a bad mother? What if something goes wrong? My mother died in childbirth with Caroline. What if the same thing happens to me?" "It will not," Samuel said fiercely, even though he could not possibly promise that. "You are strong and healthy, and we will get the doctor from town when the time comes. You are going to be fine, and the baby is going to be fine, and we are going to be a family." Margaret clung to him, and Samuel held her and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Women died in childbirth all the time, especially out here where medical care was limited. But he could not let himself dwell on that. He had to believe that everything would be all right. Emily and Caroline were thrilled when they heard the news. Emily immediately went into protective mode, insisting that Margaret rest more and not do any heavy lifting. Caroline started planning the nursery and talking about all the things the baby would need. Samuel found himself swept up in their enthusiasm, and his fear gradually gave way to excitement. The spring of 1879 brought new life to the ranch in more ways than one. The snow melted, revealing green grass underneath, and the cattle that had survived the winter looked healthy and strong. Emily's garden began to sprout, and Caroline's chickens started laying more eggs as the days grew longer. And Margaret's belly grew round with their child, a visible reminder of the future they were building. Samuel found himself working harder than ever, driven by the need to provide for his growing family. He expanded the herd by purchasing several more head of cattle from a rancher to the south. He repaired and improved the barn and the fences. He even started building a proper house, something bigger than the cabin and the bunkhouse combined, where they could all live together comfortably. It was hard work, but Samuel had never been happier. He would come in exhausted at the end of each day, his muscles aching and his hands blistered, and find Margaret waiting for him with dinner and a smile. She would rub his shoulders while he ate, and they would talk about their day and make plans for the future. In July, when the summer heat was at its peak, Margaret went into labor. Samuel rode into town as fast as his horse could carry him and brought back the doctor, a gruff older man named Dr. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in Spokane. Emily and Caroline took charge, boiling water and gathering clean linens and doing all the mysterious things that women did during childbirth. Samuel was banished to the yard, where he paced and worried and prayed. He could hear Margaret crying out in pain, and every sound felt like a knife to his heart. Emily came out once to tell him everything was progressing normally, but normal felt like an eternity. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably only about 10 hours, he heard a different sound, a baby's cry, thin and wavering, but unmistakably alive. Samuel's knees nearly gave out with relief. Caroline came running out a few minutes later, her face flushed and her eyes bright. "It is a boy," she said. "You have a son, Samuel, and Margaret is fine. She did so well." Samuel rushed inside, barely remembering to wipe his boots. Margaret was lying in the bed, looking exhausted but radiant, and in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket Caroline had made, was the tiniest human being Samuel had ever seen. "Come meet your son," Margaret said softly. Samuel approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red wrinkled face. His eyes were closed, and he was making small snuffling sounds. Samuel reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand, and the infant immediately gripped his finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Samuel said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You are perfect. I cannot believe we made this." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked. They had discussed names, of course, but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Samuel knew exactly what felt right. "What about Thomas?" he said. "After the man who saved my life, Thomas Garrison." Margaret smiled. "Thomas Garrison," she repeated. "I like it. Welcome to the world, Tommy." Baby Thomas was a good baby, all things considered. He slept reasonably well and ate enthusiastically, and he seemed to thrive in the warm summer air. Emily and Caroline were devoted aunts, constantly wanting to hold him and play with him. Samuel found himself completely besotted, sneaking away from work multiple times a day just to check on his son. Margaret recovered well from the birth, though Samuel could tell she was more tired than she let on. He tried to take on more of her chores, insisting she focus on herself and the baby. Emily and Caroline pitched in too, and together they managed to keep everything running smoothly. As Thomas grew, the ranch continued to grow with him. Samuel sold some of his cattle in the fall, earning enough money to buy more supplies and seed for the next year's crops. They had a successful harvest from Emily's garden, canning and preserving enough vegetables to last through the winter. Caroline's chickens multiplied, and she started selling eggs in town for extra income. The house Samuel had been building was finished just before the first snow of 1879, and they all moved in together. It was a beautiful place, with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace. Samuel and Margaret took the master bedroom, Emily and Caroline shared another, and the third was set up as a nursery for Thomas. Having everyone under one roof was an adjustment, but it worked better than Samuel had expected. They were a family now, all of them, bound together by more than just business or convenience. They celebrated holidays together, supported each other through hard times, and shared in the joys of daily life. In the spring of 1880, Caroline started courting a young man from town, a farmer's son named Daniel Brooks. Samuel was skeptical at first, protective of his sister-in-law, but Daniel proved himself to be honest and hard-working. He married Caroline in June, and they moved to his family's farm about 5 miles away. It was bittersweet to see her go, but she visited often, and Samuel was happy she had found someone good. Emily was courted by several men over the next year, but she turned them all down. "I am not interested in marriage," she told Samuel and Margaret one evening. "I am happy here, helping run the ranch. This is where I belong." Samuel and Margaret respected her decision, though they sometimes worried about her being alone. But Emily seemed content, throwing herself into the work of the ranch and becoming as skilled as any rancher Samuel had ever met. In 1881, Margaret became pregnant again. This time, Samuel was less terrified, though still anxious. The pregnancy went smoothly, and in early 1882, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose. She had Margaret's honey-colored eyes and Samuel's dark hair, and she was even tinier than Thomas had been. Thomas, now 2.5 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit next to her cradle for hours, watching her sleep and trying to make her laugh. Samuel and Margaret marveled at how quickly their family was growing, how much their lives had changed since that day behind the general store. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1883, they had a substantial herd of cattle, acres of productive farmland, and a reputation as one of the most successful operations in the area. Samuel hired on a couple of ranch hands to help with the growing workload, and Emily managed them with an iron fist that Samuel had to admire. Margaret proved to have a head for business, keeping careful records of their expenses and profits. She was the one who suggested they start selling beef directly to restaurants and hotels in Spokane, cutting out the middleman and increasing their profits significantly. Her plan worked brilliantly, and by 1884, they were making more money than Samuel had ever dreamed possible. They used the money wisely, investing back into the ranch and also setting aside savings for their children's futures. Samuel never forgot what it was like to have nothing, and he was determined that his children would never experience that kind of desperation. In the evenings after the children were in bed, Samuel and Margaret would sit on the porch of their house and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they would talk about the day, about plans for the ranch, about their hopes and dreams. Other times, they would just sit in comfortable silence, her hand in his, grateful for everything they had built together. "Do you ever think about that day behind the general store?" Margaret asked one evening in the summer of 1885. "All the time," Samuel admitted. "It was the day my life really began." I thought my life was ending, Margaret said softly. I was so lost and scared, and I did not think there was any way forward. And then you came around that corner and sat down beside me. You did not try to fix everything or tell me it would be okay. You just listened. That was what I needed most. I almost kept walking, Samuel confessed. I almost decided it was not my business and went on my way. I think about that sometimes, about how different everything would be if I had made that choice. But you did not, Margaret said. You stopped, and you listened, and you offered help when I desperately needed it. You changed my life, Samuel. You saved my sisters and me, and you gave us a home and a future. I love you so much. I love you too, Samuel said, pulling her close. More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. You and the children are my whole world. They sat there as the stars came out, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Inside the house, Samuel could hear Emily reading a bedtime story to Thomas and Sarah, her voice carrying through the open windows. It was a sound of home, of family, of everything good and right in the world. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, all the normal trials of running a ranch. But there were also birthdays and holidays, first words and first steps, the satisfaction of a job well done and a life well lived. In 1887, Margaret gave birth to their third child, another boy they named James. He was a fussy baby, unlike his siblings, but he eventually settled down and became a sweet, curious child who followed his father everywhere. Caroline and Daniel had children of their own, 3 daughters in quick succession. The cousins played together whenever the families visited, running wild through the ranch and getting into all sorts of mischief. Emily remained devoted to the ranch, but Samuel noticed her spending more time with the local school teacher, a quiet widow named Grace Patterson. He never asked directly, but he was happy to see Emily finally finding companionship. By 1890, Samuel was 38 years old, and Margaret was 33. They had been married for 11 years, and Samuel loved her more with each passing day. She had grown even more beautiful with time, her face showing the laugh lines and character that came from a life fully lived. She was an incredible mother, patient and loving, but firm when necessary. She was also still his partner in every sense of the word, working alongside him to make decisions about the ranch and their family. Thomas was 11 now, already showing signs of becoming a capable rancher. He could ride as well as any adult and had a natural understanding of cattle. Sarah was 8, bright and inquisitive, constantly asking questions about everything. And James was 3, a ball of energy who kept everyone on their toes. One evening in September of 1890, after the children were asleep, Margaret and Samuel were sitting on the porch as they often did. Margaret had been quiet all day, and Samuel could tell something was on her mind. "What is it?" he asked gently. Margaret smiled. "I am pregnant again," she said. "I found out this morning." Samuel felt a rush of emotions, joy, excitement, a touch of worry. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Happy," Margaret said. "A little overwhelmed, but mostly happy. I love being a mother, and I love our family. One more just seems right." Samuel pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Then I am happy too," he said. "We will make it work, just like we always do." Their 4th child, a daughter they named Catherine, was born in the spring of 1891. She had blonde hair like Caroline and blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She was a quiet baby, content to observe the chaos of the household with a wise expression that made Samuel laugh. With 4 children and a thriving ranch, life was busy, but it was also full of love and purpose. Samuel woke up every morning grateful for the life he had, for the woman who slept beside him and the children who called him father. He remembered that young man who had been lost and alone, wandering through snowstorms with no hope, and he marveled at how far he had come. The ranch that he and Margaret and Emily had built together was more than just a successful business. It was a legacy, something solid and real that would outlast them. They employed several people from town, providing good jobs and fair wages. They donated to the local school and helped neighbors in need. They were respected members of the community, known for their integrity and generosity. In 1895, Thomas turned 16 and Samuel began seriously training him to eventually take over the ranch. The boy was eager to learn, soaking up everything Samuel could teach him about land management and animal husbandry and business. Samuel watched his son grow into a capable young man and felt a deep sense of pride. Sarah, at 13, had become interested in medicine. She spent hours reading medical books that Dr. Henderson loaned her, and she often accompanied him on house calls to assist. Samuel and Margaret encouraged her ambitions, even though they knew it would be difficult for a woman to become a doctor. But if anyone could do it, Samuel believed it was his determined daughter. James, at 8, was showing signs of having his mother's head for numbers. He loved helping Margaret with the ranch accounts, and his arithmetic was already more advanced than most adults. Samuel suspected he might end up in banking or business rather than ranching, and that was fine too. He wanted his children to follow their own paths. Catherine, at 4, was still too young for her personality to be fully formed, but she was already showing signs of being the most adventurous of the bunch. She was constantly climbing things she should not and exploring places she was not supposed to go. Samuel spent a lot of time rescuing her from various predicaments, but he could not help but laugh at her fearlessness. Emily, now in her late 30s, had finally admitted to her relationship with Grace Patterson. They did not live together, which would have been scandalous, but everyone knew they were devoted to each other. Samuel and Margaret supported them completely, grateful that Emily had found happiness. Caroline and Daniel's farm was also thriving, and their daughters were growing into lovely young women. The two families remained close, celebrating every holiday and milestone together. It was everything Samuel had dreamed of when he first sat down beside a crying woman behind a general store 17 years ago. One Sunday in October of 1896, Samuel and Margaret took a rare day off from ranch work. They packed a picnic lunch and rode out to the hill where Samuel had proposed all those years ago. The children were with Emily for the day, giving them some much-needed time alone. They sat on the hill watching the mountains, eating cold chicken and fresh bread, and enjoying the crisp autumn air. Samuel held Margaret's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, the way he had done 1,000 times before. "I have been thinking," Margaret said, "about how far we have come. Do you remember how scared I was that day behind the general store? How certain I was that there was no way forward?" "I remember," Samuel said. "I could never have imagined this," Margaret said, gesturing at the landscape spread out before them. The ranch buildings were visible in the distance, the cattle grazing peacefully in the fields. This life, this family, this happiness, it seemed impossible then. "Nothing is impossible when you have the right partner," Samuel said. Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes shining. "You were right, you know. That first day when you said there are always options, even when you cannot see them. You were the option I did not know existed. You were the answer to prayers I had not even said yet. You saved me just as much as I saved you," Samuel said seriously. "I was drifting, Margaret. I had land and money and no idea what to do with it. I was lonely in a way I did not even recognize until you came into my life. You and your sisters gave me purpose. You gave me family. You gave me everything that matters." They kissed there on the hill, the same place where they had gotten engaged, and Samuel felt the same rush of love and gratitude he had felt that day. After all these years, after all the challenges and triumphs, Margaret was still the person he wanted to share everything with. As they rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, Samuel thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. If Margaret's father had not died, if the bank had not foreclosed, if she had not been crying behind that general store at the exact moment Samuel happened to walk by, none of this would exist. Their children would not have been born. The ranch would not have become what it was. Two families would not have been saved and rebuilt. But all those things had happened, and Samuel and Margaret had found each other at exactly the right moment. They had chosen to take a chance on each other, to build something together from nothing. And that choice had changed everything. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new changes and challenges. In 1898, Thomas married a lovely young woman from town named Anna Whitfield. They built a house on the far corner of the ranch property, and Thomas took on more and more responsibility for the day-to-day operations. Samuel was happy to step back a bit, spending more time with his younger children and with Margaret. Sarah left for medical school in 1900, one of the first women accepted into the program. Samuel and Margaret were incredibly proud, even though they missed her terribly. She wrote long letters about her studies and experiences, and Samuel saved everyone. In 1902, Emily passed away suddenly from pneumonia. She was only 43, and her death hit everyone hard. Grace was devastated, and Samuel and Margaret tried to support her as best they could. They buried Emily on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the property she had helped build. Samuel stood at the graveside and remembered the fierce young woman who had been so suspicious of him, who had demanded contracts and protections for her sisters, who had eventually become one of his closest friends and most trusted partners. "She made this place what it is," Samuel said to Margaret that night, holding her as she cried. "We could not have done it without her." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I miss her so much already." Grief was part of life, Samuel knew, but it was balanced by joy and love and all the good things they continued to build. James went off to business school in 1905 and eventually became a successful accountant in Spokane. Catherine, now 14, was talking about becoming a lawyer, another ambitious goal for a woman, but one Samuel had no doubt she could achieve. By 1910, Samuel and Margaret were in their late 50s and had been married for 31 years. The ranch was now run primarily by Thomas, with Samuel serving as an advisor and consultant. They had 13 grandchildren between Thomas, Sarah, James, and Catherine, and the house was constantly full of noise and chaos and love. Samuel and Margaret spent most of their time now just enjoying each other's company, taking long walks around the property, spoiling their grandchildren, and remembering all the years they had shared. Samuel's hair had gone completely gray, and Margaret's face was lined with wrinkles. But to him, she was just as beautiful as she had been that day behind the general store. One evening in the summer of 1912, they were sitting on the porch watching yet another sunset. Catherine's twin daughters were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Inside, Margaret could hear Thomas and Anna discussing plans for expanding the cattle operation. "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret asked suddenly. Samuel thought about that. There were things he wished he had done differently, certainly. He wished Emily had lived longer. He wished he had spent more time with his children when they were young instead of working so hard. He wished he had told Margaret he loved her more often, though he tried to say it every day. But regrets? No, he did not have those. "Not a single one," he said. "You?" "Not one," Margaret agreed. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "We built a good life, did we not?" "The best life," Samuel said. "All because I heard you crying and decided to stop and listen." "All because you cared enough to help a stranger," Margaret corrected. "You are a good man, Samuel Garrison. You always have been." They sat there until the stars came out, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and all it had become, about the future that stretched out bright and promising before their family. And Samuel thought about that young man who had been so lost, and that young woman who had been crying alone behind a store, and how they had found each other and built something beautiful together. It had not always been easy. There had been hard winters and drought years, sick children and failed crops, moments of doubt and fear and exhaustion. But they had faced it all together, supporting each other, loving each other, choosing each other every single day. That was the real secret, Samuel thought. Not grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but the daily choice to show up, to work hard, to be kind, to love even when it was difficult. He and Margaret had made that choice thousands of times over the years, and it had built a life that was rich and full and meaningful. As they finally went inside for the night, Samuel took one last look at the ranch spread out under the stars. 34 years ago, this had been just raw land and impossible dreams. Now it was home to multiple generations, a thriving business that employed dozens of people, a legacy that would continue long after he and Margaret were gone. And it all started because he heard a woman crying and decided to sit beside her and listen. In 1915, Samuel and Margaret celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch. It was a massive party, with tables groaning under the weight of food, and children running everywhere, and music and laughter filling the air. Samuel stood with Margaret, watching their family celebrate, and felt a contentment so deep it almost brought tears to his eyes. Thomas gave a toast, thanking his parents for building the ranch and teaching him everything he knew. Sarah spoke about how her parents had always encouraged her dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. James talked about the business lessons he had learned from watching them manage the ranch. And Catherine, now a successful lawyer in Spokane, spoke about the importance of integrity and kindness, values her parents had instilled in her from birth. But the best moment came when the youngest grandchild, Thomas, and Anna's 5-year-old son, Samuel Jr., climbed onto his grandfather's lap and asked, "Grandpa, how did you and Grandma fall in love?" Samuel looked at Margaret, who smiled and nodded for him to tell the story. So he did, telling his grandchildren about finding their grandmother crying behind a store, about sitting beside her and listening to her troubles, about offering help and building a partnership that became a family. "The most important thing," Samuel said, addressing all the children gathered around, "is that we chose to help each other. Your grandmother needed a way forward, and I needed a purpose. Together, we built all of this. And that is what family is about. Choosing to support each other, to work together, to love each other even when things are hard." The children listened with rapt attention, and Samuel knew that at least some of them would remember this lesson, that the true measure of a life was not in wealth or success, but in the relationships you built and the people you helped and the love you shared. As the party continued into the evening, Samuel and Margaret slipped away for a quiet moment alone. They walked to Emily's grave on the hill and stood there hand in hand, remembering the sister and friend who had been such an important part of their lives. "She would be proud of what we have built," Margaret said softly. "She would probably point out all the ways we could do it better," Samuel said with a smile. "But yes, I think she would be proud." They stood there for a while longer, then walked back to the party, to their children and grandchildren, to the life they had built together from tears and desperation and hope. Samuel Garrison lived to be 72 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1920. Margaret held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering that she loved him and that he had given her a beautiful life. She lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, before joining him in the family plot on the hill overlooking the ranch. The ranch continued to thrive for generations after them, passed down from Thomas to his children, and eventually to their children. The story of how it started, with a cowboy who heard a woman crying and stopped to listen, became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and holidays. And somewhere in all those years and all those tellings, the essential truth remained the same. That love and partnership and choosing to help each other can build something that lasts beyond a single lifetime. That the most important moments are often the ones where you stop and listen, where you offer help without expecting anything in return, where you choose compassion over convenience. Samuel and Margaret's legacy was not just the land or the business or even their children and grandchildren. It was the example they set of what a life lived with love and purpose could become. It was the reminder that sometimes the best things start with the simplest act of kindness. And it was the proof that when you find the right person and build something together, you can overcome anything and create something truly beautiful. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and loss and the passing of time. But it also ended with a family that stretched across generations, with land that had been carefully tended and passed down, with a community that had been enriched by their presence, and with a love that had never wavered from that first moment behind the general store until the very end. And really, Samuel thought in his final moments, that was all anyone could hope for. A life well lived, a love well shared, and a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. He had been blessed beyond measure, all because he had made the choice to stop and sit beside a crying woman and listen to her story. That single act of compassion had changed everything, not just for him and Margaret, but for all the generations that came after them. As Margaret laid flowers on his grave months after his passing, surrounded by their 4 children and 13 grandchildren, she thought about how afraid she had been that day behind the general store, how certain she had been that there was no hope, no future, no way forward. And then a kind stranger had sat down beside her and changed everything. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, knowing somehow that Samuel could hear her, "for stopping, for listening, for loving me, for building this life with me. Thank you for everything." And if the wind carried her words across the ranch, past the house they had built together, and the fields they had planted and the cattle they had raised, past the graves of loved ones lost and the homes of children and grandchildren, all the way to wherever Samuel's spirit now resided, she liked to think he heard her and smiled, because after everything, after all the years and all the challenges and all the love, those were the words that mattered most. Thank you for the choice to stop and listen, for the choice to help, for the choice to love, for all the choices big and small that had built a life worth living and a love worth remembering. And as the sun set over the ranch one final time in Margaret's memory, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and crimson, she knew that their story was complete. Not perfect, because no life is perfect, but full and rich and meaningful in all the ways that truly counted. The woman who had been crying alone behind the general store had found her happy ending after all, and the cowboy who had sat beside her and listened had found his purpose and his home. Together, they had built something that would last forever, a legacy of love and family, and the simple, powerful act of choosing kindness when it mattered most.